Hi, I'm Ken Fisher. Welcome to the 19th season of CityWide. My guest on this edition of CityWide is Manhattan Borough President Gale Brewer. Welcome to CityWide.
Thank you.
5 boroughs, 5 borough presidents. Each of you has a slightly different vision of the job because the boroughs are so different. So what is your vision? You've been the borough president since January.
Well, first of all, I get along with the other borough presidents. We have so much fun together, which you can't always say about colleagues, but we have a great time. Obviously, I served with some of them, and we have fun. But Manhattan, so obviously land use. There's very little land. What exists is expensive, and we all want affordable housing. So we've started doing some pre-planning with South Street Seaport, East Midtown, Lenox Terrace in Harlem, where we sit down with the community boards, elected officials, stakeholders, and say, what do we want in this area? So we want affordable housing, but we don't want to build to the moon. So we're working on planning. That's different than other boroughs where there's more interest because there's more land. That's number one. I think the second issue, of course, is just we're all working on schools, but we have, for instance, in Lower Manhattan, 20,000 people in the past. Now we have 65,000 people living there. So we're very, very overcrowded in the schools, and we have to plan for that and make it part of the planning. We've also been working a lot in terms of Manhattan with tremendous expertise being developed at the community board level. We got 12 community boards, and we interviewed 600 people for the positions in this year. And now we're doing intensive technology training. We've got some funding for that, and we're also making sure that we have land use. You've done this, land use, landmarking, all kinds of sessions, parliamentary procedures, because they are all going to be bounced upon, hit upon on land use decision making, particularly some of the uptown boards.
What percentage are new members?
About a quarter, because
that's a lot.
It is a lot, and people have moved on. We've appointed some. We work with the city council, and the older members. To be honest with you, I was on my board for years, so I know you know your boards in Brooklyn. The fact of the matter is, even though you've been on parliamentary procedure, land use decisions, you still need upgrading.
A lot of the work that you do is about consensus building, getting people into a room and trying to come up with either agreement on something, or if there's a disagreement, at least it's on a principled basis. Given the limited power that you have, how do you do that?
Well, that's what we're trying to do with this pre-planning on land use. For instance, South Street Seaport, historic area, Economic Development Corporation and the administration had planned for a big tower to go in the middle to pay for the museum and the pier restoration. But we said it's a historic district. We'd like to have the tower elsewhere, and we want to figure out the funding. So that's an example. You bring in the city agencies, the developer, the community board, and all the neighborhood businesses.
Why should somebody listen to you? Why would they even participate in that process?
I think to the credit of this administration, I think when you have a huge group of people who meet on a regular basis, in this case, the mediator, facilitator was paid for by the city because this is a big, high-profile area. And I think at the end, they want to see a process that includes some of the ideas that come out of the process. So it's a gamble, but the idea is you end up with consensus as opposed to fights about development. Development is the most contentious issue, I believe, in the city of New York, at least in Manhattan, to differentiate perhaps from other boroughs. So that's how you do it. You put people in the room, and we're doing that in 4 or 5 different instances. East Midtown, very, very high-profile area. We're working with Councilmember Dan Garodnick, but we're also working with City Planning Commission. So when they have a stake in the game, they're going to provide the facilitator, then I think you get some outcome that people want.
You were a city council member for 12 years?
Correct.
And a long career in government, city government before that. How is being borough president different from being a council member?
Well, the council members, you know, had legislative meetings, because I know you chaired a committee when you were there so extremely well. So you had a meeting at 10 a.m. and you had a meeting at 1 p.m. on many days, and you had every month a couple of council meetings. So it's more prescribed in terms of the time, and you pass legislation. The borough president can introduce legislation with a council member. And in fact, we've already got a lot of bills that have passed or are pending in the city council, because I do love, as I'm sure you do, the legislative process. The issues are not that different. Land use, schools, jobs, healthcare, quality of life, we're all dealing with those on a regular basis. I think the difference is what you just said. You have the opportunity as Manhattan Borough President to bring people together. In other words, you really can bring all the stakeholders in any part of the borough and try to resolve. These are complicated issues, not just development, school area, discussions about parent organizations, all the questions about where something should be built, open space, athletics. You know, the listing is endless. So that's what you do, and you do that through the Borough Board, where you bring together elected officials and the community boards on a monthly basis. So it's a consensus building office in large measure.
The council had to adopt the budget, and there was an opportunity for council members to play some role in influencing that. As borough president, you get an allocation of funds. It may be small, but it's money where you basically get to decide how it gets spent. How are you approaching that?
So you get capital money that's based on a percentage of the capital budget put out by the administration. And then, of course, you get a little expense money. But the capital money is mostly what you get. And the fact of the matter is, we had an independent panel. I actually do not make those decisions. It was something that I feel strongly about. It's transparent. So it is not political. It is based on need. The bad news is you get an amount. I think we got, you know, a request of some $300 million in Manhattan, and we had a very small amount to give out. So the fact of the matter is, that's how we do it. We bring in people who don't have a conflict, and they look at the proposals and make a decision.
But isn't every budget decision political in some extent? If you make the decision, for example, to allocate money to parks
Yes.
as opposed to libraries,
Right.
you can call it a policy decision, but at the end of the day, it's still a discretionary decision that somebody's making.
I agree. I think the only difference is we work with a panel as opposed to me going through the list and saying, I want this one because I know the librarian. You know, somebody says this is a good proposal from the panel. But it's a hard decision. We actually had many, many meetings with this panel to make the decision. Every borough president can do it differently.
This is going to sound like an aggressive question.
I like aggressive questions, Ken.
And let me just tell you, I asked your predecessor the same question. And hopefully one day I'll ask your successor that question. So Manhattan generates a majority of the jobs in the city, a majority of the property taxes, a majority of the tourists come here. And I would say that Lena Dunham, to the contrary notwithstanding, that the New York brand is in large part driven by the institutions in Manhattan. So when it comes to city resources, sanitation, for example, or security, do you think that Manhattan should be treated differently from the other boroughs?
Well, I think the twofold. First of all, we do have issues regarding how much senior funding, how much OTPS, other, you know, the decisions of how much the office and so on. And I think Manhattan certainly has the largest share of what you just described. But I'm very willing, because of all the wanting to be collegiate, to work with the other borough presidents. We're just meeting with the mayor's office to discuss right now some senior funding that all 5 borough presidents get. I am, you know, not interested in having fights with my fellow borough presidents over this. I do think that we are allocated, in some cases, a smaller budget in terms of the office itself. We don't have such a grand Brooklyn, you know, borough president offices as Brooklyn does. I remember that was renovated by the taxpayers. Controversial, but it's a beautiful renovation. So, you know, I'm willing to work on that. I'm more interested, to be honest with you, of working with the administration to solve these problems, you know, the affordable housing, the school issues, the open space, and the parks. And if I can do that, then I'm a happy camper. It's all about making sure that something gets done for the residents. It takes money, but also you can get it from other sources, to be honest with you.
There's an old joke that New York is the only city that has its own foreign policy. Recently, you came back from a trip overseas. Where did you go? Why did you go there?
Well, I went to Israel. I went for a day and a half, very short trip. I went with the West Side COJO, a coalition of Jewish organizations. Michael Landau's the head of it. I've been obviously friends with them during my council days. And so we actually went together in December 2002. It was the second Intifada, and I think we were the only persons in the dining room at the King David. So we were there to be solidarity with the people of Israel. And, you know, there's a situation, it's called in Israel as opposed to a war, but we were there for a day and a half. We did go see an Iron Dome facility.
This is more recently, the second trip.
Second time, yeah. We just went a couple of weeks ago, and we saw an Iron Dome in the desert and how that amazing technology works. We saw it work. In addition, we did hear a siren when we were in Jerusalem, and we did go to the basement of the building we were staying in. So I do see it was a mission of solidarity. Going to Israel is always political. There is a large Jewish community in the borough of Manhattan and in the city of New York, but I've been there 4 or 5 times in the past, so it's not a new place for me to go. And I feel I'm very honored to have been asked by the COJO to go with them.
Do you feel that it was appreciated by the officials or the people that you met when you were there?
We did. We met with the mayor of Jerusalem. We met with people from the prime minister's office. We met with economists. Yes, it was unbelievably warm and hospitable. And they were very appreciative, and I obviously was appreciative of their hospitality.
How many parades do you march in every year?
Well, I just did one in terms of the Labor Day parade. Right. I do the Greek parade, I do the Pride parade, I do the Israel parade. You know, you do as many as you can possibly fit into your schedule, and I do enjoy them.
So what about the St. Patrick's Day parade?
Well, you know, I was a big question mark because we've always gone to the breakfast and then we left. That was always a tradition in New York City for those of us who are supportive of gay rights.
Pay your respects, but don't necessarily lend your names.
Exactly. So we don't know what's going to happen this year. I assume we march.
We're going to continue our conversation with Borough President Gale Brewer when CityWide continues right after this. Welcome back to CityWide. We're speaking with Manhattan Borough President Gale Brewer. What has been the biggest surprise?
Well, I think the fact that there are so many challenges, you know, coming from the west side of Manhattan, where people are involved every minute of the day. We have the highest vote turnout in the city of New York. And I find that in other places, that kind of interest is not as strong. And so we need to make it as strong. I mean, I do hear some of my colleagues in the city council say, you know, we want to have the same participation that exists on the west side. And I'm a big believer that if this participation change follows. So
how do you engage citizenry in neighborhoods, particularly poorer neighborhoods or communities of color where they may feel that whatever they do is pointless because no one's paying attention? How do you get people involved?
I think it's a very good question, and I don't certainly have the answers, but one example would be, I believe that my showing up in as many small organizational discussions, not just the big fancy ones or one where there's press, but you know, telling people that we in the Borough President's office care and we want to see a change for this, you know, quality of life issue or this housing issue. I think the second issue is you show that there's success. So it's not just a futile endeavor. So you show when people have a small request, a street sign, some kind of slowing down of traffic, fixing up the building, that they can have an impact. And you also, third, you support those organizations that are doing the right thing and that are organizing housing groups or tenant groups that are successful and not ones that have a poor record. I mean, that's what I know to do, and you know, in the few short months that we've been involved, I think we're showing that. That's the only way I know to do it.
For a large part of your career, you were an activist for better use of technology in government at a time when half the world hadn't heard of Y2K and Facebook wasn't even an idea in a college student's head. how can government do a better job of using technology for citizen engagement? And perhaps just as important or more important, how can government do a better job of managing technology contracts? We had Mike Bloomberg, who made his fortune in technology, had hundreds of millions of dollars of cost overrun. So you can treat that as two different questions: citizen engagement, but also managing the process.
Well, in terms of citizen engagement, we passed in the City Council the Open Data Bill, the most progressive in terms of how many parts to it exist in the whole country. And let me give you an example. So now every single city agency has to put their databases into one portal. That does not exist anywhere else in the country. And now that's great, but now the community boards and citizens need to be able to peel it back like an onion. So that's what I'm talking about with community boards. We're going to get them the technology and the staffing to be able to do that. If you go to a community board meeting and you have monitors up that can show how many high school students, how many seniors, how many affordable units in this community and how long they're going to be there or not, then the community can make better decisions. So the first is citizen participation. How can technology tell you what exists on your block? That would be very helpful to people. Then they can plan. In terms of the larger issue of management, we were all kind of shocked at the depth of the overrun, shall we say, for city time. And how to
that was a program to help the city manage its payroll.
Correct. And I'd always complained in the second big project, which is what we call the 9/11 project. Some people call it PSAC. You'll hear different names for it. But it's basically the merger of all the 911 systems, both in Brooklyn and a second area building in the Bronx. $2 billion is what's gone into it in terms of capital and hundreds of millions in terms of expense. I'm not sure it was ever needed. So now Mayor de Blasio has put, I don't know if it's a second team or third team of oversight monitors to see if this project is, what is going to happen when it's being built, where are we with the overruns. My understanding is he's now pulled the whole thing in-house as opposed to hiring consultants. One of the issues, if you have outside consultants, you'll have them forever because an expertise does not get developed in-house. And that's what seems to be happening with this huge 911 system. And I'm on record for 12 years of complaining about it. And I was always told, Gale, we need it. The police department wants it. And I've heard people say it wasn't ever needed at all.
One of the people whose judgment I trust when it comes to technology talks about disruptive technologies as offering the opportunity for what he calls legal arbitrage. Mm-hmm. So if you are Airbnb, almost happened with Lyft, the taxi service, but take Airbnb as an example. They come into New York, they are now in a struggle with the Attorney General over whether their operation is legal in New York or not. And they're using some of the revenue that they raised here to promote a lobbying campaign, basically saying, what we're doing is good for the city. It may not be good for you and your apartment building to have people coming and going, but overall for the city, it's a good idea. So first, talk a little bit about your take on what they're doing, but also talk about how government policy can keep up with these changes.
Right. Well, the Airbnb is interesting. Obviously, I sit on a lot of technology panels as former chair of the committee and, as you suggest, interested in this topic and pretty knowledgeable. And at first, the technology committee was on my case. You know, Gale, how can you be against it? This is the only way that technologists can visit New York because they can't afford the hotels. I said, does anybody here have a rent-stabilized apartment? You can lose even more rent-regulated apartments. We've lost 100,000 in the last 10 years in the city of New York. We could lose more if Airbnb takes over many more of our rent-regulated apartments. And who wants people coming and going in a building whom they don't know? So we then have, as a group, elected officials, brought this issue to the Attorney General's office. I think we're a different model than a community that's all homeowners, where people are home, where people know each other. People in your building don't know if you're coming and going because they don't know all their neighbors. So the Airbnb model is not one that fits perfectly into the city of New York. people should know that if you're staying in your apartment and the Airbnb comes, that's fine. It's when you rent it and you disappear overseas or to your friend's house and you try to make money off of it. So it is a complicated housing situation to start with, and Airbnb makes it more complicated. And we do want the AG's office to take a really close look at that. And I think their ads are quite deceiving. We could go on and on about that. So I am concerned about, the barter concept is a good one. That's what the technology community is pushing, whether it's taxis or housing. You know, they want people to be able to have a different method of thinking about how they live in the city of New York. But I think you have to realize that we're big and we're complicated, and people who are middle income and low income also need to have a place in the city in terms of their living situations. It's a very complicated issue, needless to say.
Well, let's look at development more broadly for a second. The de Blasio administration has staked its legacy on the creation of 200,000 housing units in the next 10 years, with 80,000 of them being new affordable units. Recently, Carl Weisbrod, chair of the City Planning Commission, was talking about the fact that the city's population is expected to grow, I think, by 600,000 people in the next 30 years. So if I'm doing the math correctly, we need to be producing 20,000 units of new housing, regardless of what the rent is, 20,000 new units of new housing just to keep pace. What is the strategy for doing that, particularly at a time when the city is making it more complicated for developers and where advocates, including yourself, are advocating more conditions in order for them to be done? How are we possibly going to meet that need, let alone produce enough housing to bring prices down?
Well, the first issue is not only do we need to build new, but we need to preserve what we have. So part of the 200,000 is preservation, because to the credit of Mayor Bloomberg, he may have added 165,000, but we also lost almost that many when we were not preserving affordable housing. So I just want to throw that in. But I do think this issue of building new is something that the administration is focused on, and we're all trying to help. We've had a big to-do recently about the notion of if you're going to build affordable housing, it has to be in one building and not two doors for the affordable and the those who are on market. Now, of course, that does make it more complicated, as you indicated.
More expensive. You can't get city subsidies anymore for that.
Except, I might add that to the credit of Mr. Trump, for example, in my old neighborhood, my current where I live, my old council district on the west side, the rental buildings were all and continue to be affordable and market. You can't tell the difference. So in a rental building, it's very easy to do. It's when you have condos and rental where you get into a challenge. So we're working on that. That's something that we've just spent the last few months negotiating. But we do need this housing. And I think if the development community, the contractors, the unions are all interested in doing it, because it's, you know, it's jobs and it's building. One of the questions we have in Manhattan, to be different than the other boroughs, with limited space and expensive space at that, how do you do it and still maintain the contextual aspect of the neighborhood? These are huge challenges, but we're all working together to try to address them.
Well, it also goes to the character of the neighborhood, because if you look at, I think, the part of Manhattan that probably is slightly underdeveloped would be Harlem. Would you support an upzoning of Harlem, even if it meant that the nature of the neighborhood would change?
Well, that's the issue. In other words, that's why I talked about pre-planning earlier. For instance, in East Harlem, there's vacant land. And you also talk about areas over churches and synagogues, or you talk about areas over commercial, or you talk about building on the New York City Housing Authority. All of this is possible, but it has to be done in consultation with a very lengthy planning process. And that's what we do in the Borough President's office, what we can do, which is different than a local council member, for instance. And if we do that, then I think we can be successful. As long as you have input, and people want the affordable housing, and they want it to be permanent. That's the other aspect, this absolute necessity. So if you do that, then I think you'll have more interest, and people will be positively interested.
My thanks to Manhattan Borough President Gale Brewer. I'm Ken Fisher. Thanks for joining us on this edition of CityWide. Send your comments and suggestions to CityWide at CUNY-TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016, or contact us at CUNY.TV.